Horror story. The night my grandmother died, the whole village seemed to hold its breath. She had been sick for months, her body fragile and wasted away by whatever unseen force had been draining her life. But despite the doctors and their medicines, despite the endless prayers whispered over her frail frame, nothing worked. She passed just after sunset, the light in her old house dimming as if the day itself mourned her loss. My parents sat me down by the fireplace that evening. They told me the news gently, but even at 12 years old, I felt the heavy weight of their words. "She's gone, son," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "But don't worry, she's in a better place now." He kissed my forehead, his lips cold, then went back to my mother, who was crying silently by the window. I didn't cry. Not at first. Something about it didn't seem real. But later that night, when the house was quiet and I lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, something deep inside me shifted. It wasn't sorrow or grief, it was something darker, something that whispered in the corners of my mind. It was close to midnight when I heard the soft creak of floorboards outside my window. I assumed it was my parents, restless in their grief, but then I heard it again, closer this time, as if someone was walking in the garden just beneath my window. Curiosity, mixed with a strange sense of dread, pulled me from my bed. I tiptoed across the room and peeked through the curtains. The garden was bathed in moonlight, the old trees casting long shadows across the yard. For a moment, I saw nothing but the dark outline of bushes swaying gently in the breeze. And then she appeared. My grandmother stood at the edge of the garden, her white nightgown glowing softly in the pale moonlight. Her face was hidden in the shadow of the trees, but I recognized her figure immediately, frail, but upright, standing just like she used to when she'd call me for supper, waving her hand for me to come closer. I froze, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. She had died hours ago. I had seen her body myself, cold and still, lying in her bed. This wasn't possible. But there she was, standing silently, her hand still beckoning me. The longer I stared, the more wrong everything seemed. Her movements weren't right, they were stiff, mechanical, like an old doll forced to move by invisible strings. And when she finally stepped out of the shadows, I saw her face. It wasn't the grandmother I knew. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and vacant, her mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-sentence. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips moved, though no words came out. That's when I heard the whispering, faint at first, like the wind through the trees, but growing louder with every passing second. It was her voice, but it wasn't right. It was strained, like something deep inside her was trying to break free. "Come, come," she mouthed. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The whispering followed me, even as I scrambled back to bed, pulling the covers over my head. My mind raced, trying to understand what I had seen. Had it really been her? Or was it some terrible nightmare brought on by grief and fear? I must have fallen asleep somehow because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of voices downstairs. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across my room. I rushed down, finding my grandfather sitting by the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he clutched a cup of tea. My parents were speaking to him in low voices, their faces pale and drawn. When they saw me, they stopped talking abruptly. My father stood up, guiding me outside with a strange urgency. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. He led me to the porch, where the morning light bathed the village in a soft, eerie glow. My father knelt in front of me, his hands resting heavily on my shoulders. "There's something you need to know about your grandmother," he began, his eyes darting nervously towards the door. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What is it?" My father took a deep breath, his voice trembling. "She wasn't just sick, son. Something took her." He glanced over his shoulder again, as if expecting to see something lurking behind us. And it wasn't finished. The chill that ran through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Your grandfather told us this morning," my father continued, his voice barely a whisper. "There's something out there, something that comes at night. It took your grandmother's soul, and it's looking for more." I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. My father's grip tightened. "Whatever you saw last night, don't follow it. Don't listen to it." I nodded, too terrified to say anything. But as I glanced back towards the garden, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had come for my grandmother wasn't gone. It was waiting. Sleep didn't come that night, not after what my father had told me. The words echoed in my head, twisting and distorting with every passing minute. Something took her. And it's not finished. I lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling as they seemed to shift and writhe in the darkness. Every creak of the house felt louder, every whisper of wind through the trees outside sounded like soft voices calling my name. I couldn't shake the image of her, my grandmother, standing there, her body bathed in that pale, otherworldly light. Her lips had moved, but no sound came. Or maybe it had, and I just couldn't hear it over the pounding of my own heartbeat. But those words my father had spoken weighed on me like a heavy blanket of dread. "It took your grandmother's soul." I kept thinking about what that meant. I hadn't believed in ghosts or spirits before. At least, not really. But after seeing her like that, how could I explain it away? And that strange, stiff way she had moved, like something was controlling her from the inside, something using her body for its own purposes. The hours dragged on, the darkness outside pressing in against the thin walls of the house. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force sleep, but every time I did, I saw her face. Not the warm, wrinkled smile I'd grown up with, but the cold, glassy-eyed stare she'd given me from the garden. Finally, around midnight, I gave up. There was no point in lying there, waiting for sleep that would never come. My body hummed with restless energy, and my mind spun in circles. I needed air. I needed to clear my head. I crept downstairs, careful not to wake my parents. The house was deathly quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Its rhythmic tick-tock seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat, growing louder as I approached the front door. I stopped for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, thinking about what my father had said. "Don't listen to it. Don't follow it." His voice played in my mind, a warning I didn't want to ignore. But something stronger pushed me forward, an irrational curiosity, maybe, or a stubborn need to prove that what I had seen was just my imagination. The night air hit me like a cold wave as I stepped outside. The village was still, the streets deserted under the pale glow of the moon. The sky was cloudless, stars scattered like pinpricks of light, but the shadows between the houses and trees felt heavier, darker than they should have. I walked toward the edge of the garden, where I had seen her the night before. The silence was overwhelming. Not even the usual sounds of crickets or owls reached my ears. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath again, waiting for something to happen. My feet carried me to the window that overlooked the garden. I paused, my hand resting against the cold glass. The moonlight illuminated the yard, casting long, twisted shadows across the grass, but nothing seemed out of place. No figure stood there this time. No white nightgown glowing in the dark. I almost sighed in relief, thinking that maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it all. But then, movement caught the corner of my eye. There. At the very edge of the trees, half hidden in the dark, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer to the window. It was her. My grandmother. Or at least, it looked like her. The same frail figure, the same nightgown flowing gently in the wind. But this time, there was something different. She wasn't just standing there. She was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward the house. Her arms hung unnaturally at her sides, her head tilted at a strange angle. And though her feet made no sound, I could almost feel the heavy weight of her steps as if each one was pressing down on the earth with unnatural force. Her eyes, those wide, glassy eyes, were fixed on me. They shimmered in the moonlight, reflecting something cold and empty, something inhuman. I should have run. I should have locked the door and never looked back. But something in me, a morbid fascination, maybe, kept me frozen in place. I watched as she drew closer, her figure passing through the twisted shadows like a ghost moving through water. Her lips moved again, like before. No sound. But this time, I could make out the shape of the words. "Come, outside." A chill ran down my spine, my body trembling as the words burned themselves into my mind. I wanted to scream, to shut my eyes and wake up from this nightmare. But I couldn't. I was trapped in her gaze, paralyzed by the slow, deliberate movement of her body. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was the sheer terror of the moment, or maybe it was some deeper force pulling me toward her. But without thinking, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The air was colder now, biting into my skin as I walked across the yard. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to hold me back. My breath fogged in front of me, swirling in the pale moonlight, and I could feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting. As I neared the spot where she stood, her figure seemed to shimmer, like smoke caught in a breeze. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The garden was empty again, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees in the wind. But I wasn't alone. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, as if something unseen had wrapped itself around my body. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw it, just beyond the trees, barely visible in the darkness. A shape. Something twisted and wrong, lurking in the shadows where my grandmother had stood. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, burning with a sickly yellow light. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. "It's waiting." My blood turned to ice, and I stumbled back toward the house, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I reached for the door, I realized something horrifying. The door wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, pulled with all my strength, but it was as if the house itself had locked me out. Panic surged through me as I looked back toward the garden, where the twisted shape in the shadows had begun to move. Slowly, deliberately, it slithered closer, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. I pounded on the door, screaming for my parents, but no sound came out. The world around me seemed to close in, the air growing thicker and thicker until I could hardly breathe. And then everything went black. When the sun rose the next morning, they found the front door ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. My parents searched the garden, the streets, the nearby woods. But there was no trace of me. All they found was a single, deep impression in the earth, as if something, or someone, had been dragged into the trees. I was gone.